Hey Vlad, good afternoon. How's it going?
I'm good, good. Super happy to be here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking time. Vlad, let's start with a quick intro, self intro. So, if you could just talk about your journey, how did you get started with B2B marketing? What was prior to Full Funnel? And I think that's your active project. Everything that you do today is around that, right? So, what was like before that?
Yeah, I was always in tech. Actually, I was an engineer, software engineer. Always worked with software engineering companies, then became a consultant, working for engineering companies. And suddenly I had to sell. And I always considered myself to be completely not commercial, could never imagine myself being in sales and marketing because I always had this idea that it is somehow, about twisting people's hands, manipulating and whatever. Sometimes how technical people have ideas about sales and marketing. But I was super fortunate that I had a colleague who was a similar background, and he taught me that sales really is all about understanding other people, understanding your customers or your prospects, giving them an advice, and then of course, yeah, by the way, we can help you with with that. And so by some chance, I became one of the best salespeople, although I wasn't a salesperson myself. We had salespeople dedicated there, but I started selling more than them. Didn't even realize it at the time. And so once I sold a huge project, it was seven figures, and didn't get any commission while the salespeople were. I was thinking, maybe it's something I should start doing for myself. And then started my company that failed, a failed startup. But during that journey, I learned a lot about marketing. Kind of had everything that I liked. It had sales in a way, right? It
Hmm.
had writing. I always loved to write. It was also a bit technical. And so, what I really love about it as well is the whole building. And now, why B2B? Because it's always been B2B. Like all the companies I've ever worked for were B2B. That was kind of like a given for me. And it was also clear that a lot of stuff that's out there is not like that was back then and still is, when it comes to marketing, doesn't really apply to B2B. And that, especially when it comes to like,
Hmm.
some sort of a niche business, serving specific industry, or, just in general, high ACV, annual contract value, deal size, whatever you like to call it. And then which comes with certain complexity,
Hmm.
multiple buyers, enterprise customers, or upper mid market. The stuff that we were doing back then just didn't work. So that was kind of what got me on the journey of figuring out, and then discovered Andre, who kind of was my mentor when it comes to B2B marketing and account-based marketing. And we decided to start working together 3 years ago, and the rest, I guess, is history, as they say.
Hmm. Do you miss or wearing the engineer's cap and building stuff at all these days?
To be honest, I mean, I loved building stuff. Like you said, I mean, you got it. Like that's the thing that I always love to do. But I get to build stuff now, and building obviously the business, building our community, building the audience, building especially content. I really enjoy creating content, and in a way, it's even like I remember when I was an engineer, what I didn't like was, especially working for a company like Sony. I worked for Sony and then Dell EMC. So these were like huge companies with large teams. And I didn't really see I saw the impact because you're building, but I didn't see the impact on the customers, right? And that's what's so cool about marketing, because you kind of make a double or triple impact. You make the impact on the company that you're marketing for, but you also make the impact on their customers. So I really enjoyed that part. And there's a lot of building in our business. The way that we set it up, at least half of the time, it's some sort of creation, some sort of creative process. So I enjoy that a lot.
Is there some kind of a mindset shift that happens when you're really building stuff, like real engineering software stuff compared to marketing? So is there a left right brain that doesn't work? Do you believe that? Or have you seen that transformation transition? And also, like you being an engineer, right? You approach marketing in a certain way compared to somebody who started with marketing. I don't know if you've thought about it, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of mindset shifts, right? Whether you're coming from engineering or not, I think there is a lot of mindset shifts as you're learning, as you're becoming better at it. We can talk about that if you want, but specifically like from the engineering perspective, I think like I I do feel like there's some advantages of going in this direction. And the first one is, especially if you're working for technical, like our customers are B2B tech companies, engineering companies in a lot of ways. And these are, so I understand that, I understand how a product is being built. I also understand, the technical people and the technical audience, which is very helpful. And they're probably one of the most difficult ones to market to. But then also, like, the way that I look at
Hmm.
marketing or basically anything is like, and with the lens or glasses of engineering, is like, how can we engineer the process? And this is like one thing that also, of course, if you're working in software, process is so important. But also, like, it's complex. There is a lot of things that you could be doing. So, but how do you, like, step by step codify or engineer that process so that it is actually repeatable, so that it can be applied? Also, being a consulting and training company, this is obviously important to us, but also that's how we approach content. If you ever seen our content, it's always like very structured. It's always like steps and
Yeah.
stuff. It's almost like
Like a process
writing code.
diagram. I was going to say that. Yeah, so it's
Yeah,
like a flow chart, right? Do
yeah,
this, and don't do this. Yeah,
yeah,
excellent. I
yeah.
get it. Cool. So this is an ABM podcast, and I wanted to get started by busting some myths around ABM. What are some common myths that you're hearing, encountering, that you would want to go and bust it?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to ABM, I mean, there is, when it comes to implementation, what we see in companies, talking to companies, we see maybe not necessarily myths, but let's say mistakes that companies make are really treating ABM as another way or another type of lead generation. And what I mean by that is, usually the way that it works is they decide on an ICP on a very high level, saying, one, two, three industries, then some regions and geographies, and then they build a large list. And this list is very often full of, it's really a wish list full of, Fortune 500 companies. Like the other day, I was speaking to a client, or just onboarding a new one. And so how are the lists built? Well, essentially they just take from, for each salesperson in that territory, the largest accounts. That's it, right? So there is no, and the problem with that is that there is no indication. Well, two problems really. There is no indication that an account has a need for your product, and the second one is, now, can you reasonably close them? Like, eventually win that deal? Because if you look at your history, if you look at the kind of deals that you are winning, it's more like you don't jump from, let's say, a 100 million company to a 100 billion, well, 100, let's say a billion company, right? It's usually a progress, right, that you need to make. Yeah. And then there are many other ones. So there is also some misconceptions that were driven by, obviously, like some of the vendors in the space, right? So a lot of people tend to believe that you need like a very sophisticated market tech, right? A technology stack, that you need a huge budget, that you need a large team in order to be able to run ABM. And like I said, also when it comes to actual implementation, a lot of people treat it as a volume game, and that's just the opposite of what ABM is.
So related to that, right? So how do you advise somebody who's had some kind of a reasonable process on which they're acquiring customers so far, and then they want to jumpstart to, it's an ABM, right? So how do you align their existing processes, programs to, and dovetailing ABM onto it, right? So typically they would have some kind of a demand gen program, right? And what are the different challenges and what are the considerations they should have to bring an ABM into that?
Yeah, so there's few questions they ask there. Like, so what is first kind of the consideration? I mean, you should be thinking we do have a deal size of, let's say, 30, 50K plus a year. I don't think it makes sense to do ABM on much smaller deals. Now, this doesn't have to be an average deal size. Maybe you say, in the highest tier of our customers, let's say we do have, whatever, a dozen, 2,000, 50, whatever, larger customers where we are doing these kind of deals. So, I mean, this is kind of definitely a precondition. Usually it is multiple buyers. It is complex, long sales cycles, right? So this is kind of the precondition, or the test that you can do for yourself to say, okay, is this really for me, right?
Hmm.
For my company. And then actually the fact that you might be doing demand generation right now is, from my perspective, a big plus, because, and this is another myth or maybe a mistake that companies make, like I mentioned, creating a wish list or just listing companies based on broad firmographics without any idea that they have a need. But now if you are doing demand generation programs, that's actually a great place to start. Let me explain. Every day I see ICP accounts, visiting our website, spending like sometimes an hour, 2 hours with multiple people from the target account. They're not reaching out to us. They're not booking the call. They're not booking. In our case, it's a discovery call. Maybe for a product company, it will be a demo, whatever it is, right? So what's going on there? And this is like really important. That's happening in a lot of companies. So if you're doing demand generation, you will have a bunch of companies that are not buying. That's fair enough. Then you will have companies that may be buying, or are in the initial stages. And then you will have, let's say, you will have sales ready companies, or those who are really in the market. Now, those who are really sales ready, they will reach out to you. These are smart people. They can find that, contact form or whatever it is on your website. But the like I said, like, you still have a lot of companies that are not reaching us. So what's going on there? Well, we don't know, and that's the point. It could be that they didn't get, they had misunderstood something, didn't get some of the questions answered. Maybe they were kind of convinced, but their colleague wasn't, right? Because again, buying committees, multiple buyers, people are kind of discussing that internally. Maybe there is some sort of shift in priority, whatever it is. Something is going on that you don't know, right? And that's kind of like a lot of companies rely on analytics and the information from
Hmm.
sales, but that's just, of course, just a very small part of the picture. And that's where the ABM comes in. So ideally you're sourcing your target accounts from your demand generation programs. Why? Because that's like, these companies and buyers are showing a high level of intent. For example, in our case, this might be visiting high intent pages, such as in our case, like consultant or product page, pricing pages, etc. Like I said, high level of engagement,
Hmm.
multiple people spending a lot of time. These are ideal customer or ideal accounts to source, as long as they fit your ICP and your qualification and disqualification criteria, right? So, in a lot of ways, having a demand gen in place is really a good place to start. Much easier than if you don't have that, if you only ran pure lead generation. And then there is a lot of other considerations and a lot of other challenges that we can address. I don't want to
No, please
just
go ahead. I think this is good. Please go
okay.
ahead.
So when it comes to actual implementation, I think really have to understand that there is a huge difference between running a successful program and starting a new program, right? So when somebody's considering to start an ABM, or they're starting with ABM and they haven't done this before, this is like important. Um, and a lot of companies, the way that they treat new programs or new initiatives is kind of like another experiment, right? So oh, let's try this, and then let's try that. But the problem with that is that if you just treat it like that, you don't do it correctly. You don't really implement it in the right way. You don't give yourself the time to learn. You don't give yourself the time to develop that process. And on the other end, you also don't give that process enough time to show whether it's doing the result. So first, evaluate whether that's a good fit for you. I gave some tips about that. Another tip that I would give as well is, if you want to implement an ABM program, make sure that you can spend at least 1 or 2 quarters having at least one marketer and one person from sales, whether that's an SDR for net new accounts, or an account executive for expanding existing accounts, expanding deals with existing accounts, or maybe accelerating the pipeline, whatever the goal might be. Which
Hmm.
is, by the way, another thing that you have to think about is like, okay, where should I start with that? But anyhow, make sure that you have that team and you give them, let's say, at least like 60, 70, 80% of that should be, at least from the marketing perspective, at least like one person that should be their primary um, activity during that 1 or 2 quarters, which is like somewhere a minimum that you will need to set up a pilot program, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So think about that. And once you're ready, now we can talk about the pilot program and how you can set it up, etc. But this is another consideration that you should make. And finally, again, when it comes to implementing ABM, we spoke about it at the beginning. A lot of the mistakes that are being made, or the myths there, have to do with the way that you build account lists, have also, which also has a lot to do with the way that you develop your ideal customer profile. So if you have never done, historical revenue and deal analysis, if you haven't to determine, okay, where should we focus? Should we focus on net new? Should we focus on expansion? Should we focus on pipeline acceleration? And then the second question is also, okay, which segments should we be focusing on? Because again, ABM going narrow, and the first step there is going into a specific segment. That will be the first step. Everything else is okay. Check, check, check. Complexity, deal size. I have the team. We are ready to do it. Then you should start with that analysis.
Awesome. This is good. I think you covered some of the questions that I had. Some parts of it, I think I still want to revisit. In terms of the readiness checklist that you just spoke about it, right? So I typically talk in terms of people, process, and technology. I think you talked a little bit around the process part, right? So how having some kind of an existing demand gen process feeding into the ABM program is the best case scenario, right? And I think you also talked a little bit about the people part, right? What's the minimum team size or the skill sets that are required? Are there any technology consideration? And also in the other two, are there some kind of a maturity that they should look for, evaluate themselves before embarking on an ABM program?
So definitely. So when it comes to technology, this kind of goes against the grain, perhaps, because I really believe, and not just believe. I mean, I've just done it so many times ourselves and with our clients.
Right.
You don't need a big technology stack. However, speaking about sourcing accounts from an ABM program, from a demand gen program, well, you do need some tools and you do need some data, right? And I'm not talking about buying intent data from a third or second party provider, whatever, whether that's like a review site like G2, or whether that's, the standard Six Sense and other data providers. But I'm talking things like, maybe reverse lookup software that will help you identify the accounts that are visiting your website and the patterns. At least having clear data in your marketing automation, whatever software you're using currently for your demand gen programs, doing a bit of data cleanup there, making sure that that's correct, so that you actually have the information about the accounts and their behavior. This is a mess in a lot of companies. So when it comes to technology, I would more focus on that, more focus on the data than about a specific technology. Potentially like installing some sort of a reverse lookup tool, like we use Albacross, doesn't really matter. A lot of other tools have that
Right.
built in. And then when it comes to maturity that you asked, I think that the main, I mean, ABM is really good at replicating your best deals, right? So what I wouldn't do is I wouldn't like start using ABM on a new market. I mean, it is possible, but that wouldn't be my
Mm.
first. I would always look for how can we stack the odds in our favor. So where can we look historically where we had good traction, where we had these large deals come in, etc. So I think when it comes to maturity, part of it, like I mentioned, is like data and having these processes at least in order. And then the second part is, do we actually have you know good logos in some segments? Is this something that is proven, or is it
Mm.
just because an exec thinks that we should go into that because they are convinced for one reason or another that we should go in a specific direction?
Excellent. Yeah, I think that was my next question, right? So, what should people focus on, right? Especially somebody who's embarking on a new ABM program, right? An acquisition versus expansion. I think you talked about maybe they should focus on expansion because that is where the sum wins already. So they can try and then work with the existing success instead of trying out like different experiments. I think I'm just like reiterating what you just said, right? So expansion is the should probably the focus area instead of focusing on acquisition. So that can come later, I guess. And within expansion, so that I think I would typically divide into going cross selling, upselling, that kind of a thing. Would also be for retention, for example, example, right? So the kind of times we are in, so the focus could be more around retention. So are you seeing programs or have you executed programs around these areas? So instead of calling at a very high level, right, retention or expansion. Uh, so have you seen ABM being implemented in the subcategories here?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I mean, you can definitely use it for, like you mentioned, you've a lot of companies call this land and expand. Like, so you land an account. Usually, this means for a lot of companies, this means whatever first implementation. Sometimes it's kind of a pilot, and then they're going to expansion. Then you may be, they may take like you know product, like depending how your pricing is structured, it could be like part of the product or some features, not all the module, whatever you way you structure this, and then like basically upselling them other features or whatever the structure is there, like you said. So this is like kind of growing the deal size with the existing departments, with the existing people there. But then it could be as well going, for example, into different, especially if when you're working with very large companies that could use your solution in other departments, in other geographies, et cetera, et cetera. This is
Right.
something that is another option that you have. And then the third option is, like you said, is really contract renewal, churn prevention, and which is really important because actually, I've read a study that, you know, on the one hand, we know this from experience that a lot of companies consider no news to be good news. Like by default, if we are not hearing any complaints, they must be happy with our product. But that is not true because I mean, according to a study that I read, was like like really really high number. I can't remember the exact number, like more than 80%, I believe, of customers will churn without letting you know, unless you ask them,
Mm.
unless you ask them, right? And another thing that is really worrisome is that in the majority of cases, when we come in the company, like obviously one of the first things you want to do is you want to interview existing customers from the selected target segment. whether it's from for expansion or whether it's for net new, right? So you obviously, this is like part of your ICP development, is interviewing those customers. And we are met very frequently, like in the vast majority of cases, we are met with resistance. Why? Well, we don't want to bother our customers, etc. But really, when you dive deeper, it's because they don't have an active, close relationship with their customer, and that's the problem. Because
Hmm.
remember, if whatever, more than 80% of customers that will churn silently or don't let you know, and then at the same time you don't have relationship with the majority of customers, then you have very little chance of preventing that churn. So building those relationships with existing customers, whether you're working on net new or you're working on expansion, should always be one of the first steps. So let me
Excellent.
kind of qualify this, because it's not necessarily, just also to kind of add another nuance, it's not necessarily always the best idea to start with expansion. There's different reasons. Maybe there is not, the opportunity is not there, or the opportunity is smaller than with net new. Maybe there are other reasons. The reason could be as simple as well, um, how the reporting structure is within the organization. Sometimes you have BDRs and SDR reporting to marketing. Well, okay, then it's much easier to control, and start a pilot for the net new. Sometimes you have, good relationship with an account executive. Well, okay, then this might be also easier than to start, let's say, with expansion. But also, we shouldn't forget that there is another option, and that is actually pipeline acceleration. So these are not deals that are won. These are not net. Well, this could be net new accounts, but there is an existing deal in the pipeline, and
Right.
that's also another way that you could use APM.
Hmm. Excellent. On the retention side of things, right? So especially, let's say, contract renewal, or there are accounts which are cold in terms of outreaches you've not established, and you just spoke about it, right? So let's say there is a realization and then they want to start engaging. So what do you think are some of the tactics, campaigns, communications that they can actually tap into and start warming up the relationship, right? So you don't want to go on month 11 and then say, hey, there is a renewal that's coming, so I'm here for you, right? I think there has to be some kind of an always on connect. So I think one of the functions to do that is the customer success. But I mean, like, if that was working, the example that you said or the stats that you provided, you wouldn't see such a high number. So there is a real problem, right? So let's say you're able to like make somebody realize that this is something that needs to be done. And how would you advise that they start
Yeah, that's a really
re-engaging
no,
again?
this is a really good question. It's not easy, right? So I think there are several things that you can do. Well, first of all, again, ask yourself, um, what is the level of relationship that we have. So I'm thinking of two completely different customers that we have, where in one case, there is a lot of service that is being added to the product. So the product itself, when it gets implemented, there is a lot of collaboration. In other words, what I'm saying there is that there is, the CS has an amazing relationship with the customer, right? So that will be like one extreme example, where maybe then it's not so much about re-engaging and building that relationship, but it could be that you then have to establish, as a marketer and an AE, have to establish a relationship with the CS and then work together with them to include, a process that will allow you to collect the, contract renewal insights, to identify whether they're getting, mm, what they need to get from the value that they want to get from the product, whether there are some plans in terms of like what are their priorities and strategic priorities, and future plans, and does that fit in our product, how can we support that, because very often they might, have whatever, let's say they have some plans to, transform their process, do that, merge with another company, whatever the plans are, and they just assume that your product might not be able to support them, because in a lot of cases they just don't know. So
mm,
proactively like figuring that out. So when you have a relationship, then it's more about uh, you know changing the process so that you're getting these insights. When you don't have a relationship, which was really your question, the re-engagement, well, there are different things that you can do. For example, I mean, a simple thing you can do is, first of all, show the appreciation. Go and check out who are the power users and the, let's say, the champions and the decision makers there. Do a quick study, check out what they like, what their hobbies are, what they're interested in. I don't know, they're in Europe and they like to go with their friends on cycling in the Alps. Well, maybe you can buy them a beautiful book with the best cycling tours. I'm just taking that
mm,
as
mm,
an
mm.
example.
Interesting. Yeah.
So I'm not talking about sending some swag, some company swag or something like that, or generic whatever cookies or t-shirts or some mugs, whatever. I'm really talking about what you would do for a really good friend or even a spouse, where you would spend some time thinking about, okay, how can I surprise them in a very positive way? And it should be, I mean, again, we're talking about large deal size, so we're talking about maybe 6 7 figures. So spending $50 or anything like that on a small present. And again, I would always definitely do it for the different people who are involved, like the power user, potentially because we want to know from the power user what they're missing, what their experience is. We want to know from that champion if they're still a champion, if they're still um, interested in working, continuing our relationship. Then potentially also decision maker, it may make sense or not. And then like I said, like sending that, and then of course like following that up with the conversation, right? So what are other things you can do? Peer-to-peer engagement. And what I mean by that is that you can make sure maybe that your CFO gets in touch with their CFO or financial director. I mean, if they're a super large company, maybe they won't be able to get in touch with their CFO, right? But whatever the appropriate level is, right?
Right.
So you can do it like that. You can like use your executives to connect to the right people inside of the company to again do this in a coordinated way to get the insights that you need and to deepen that relationship. You can do that on social, so you can be engaging with those buyers on social, especially if they're active on social. That's really easy. If they're being interviewed on podcasts or whatever, that's like super easy. But even if they're not, there may be an opportunity to engage them on social. You can obviously, like a lot of times what we do at the beginning of the project, or one of the tactics that we use, is content co-creation. So I don't know, you have a podcast, right? So you could run a series where you're featuring your best customers and you're talking about whatever. You could write some sort of an industry report, and then of course you start with your own customers, and then whatever the angle is, let's say it's kind of an ego angle, like featuring those people, featuring them could be another incentive for them to say yes, right? When you do this right, it can work really well. I mean, we had even for cold
Mm,
contacts, and I'm not talking even for new contacts, but for existing contacts. But for cold contacts, we had like more than 80% of accounts that I contacted agreed, for example, to appear on the podcast. Like when it's done well, when it's positioned well. And then this is like you and I are now chatting. You can ask me anything you want. We had a nice chat before we started the recording.
right.
We will probably chat a little bit after that. We were in contact before. We will be in contact afterwards. So there's a lot of quote unquote touch points and a lot of relationship that is being built through this conversation. Especially like, okay, you're now interviewing me as a kind of an expert, but especially when you're going to have a different conversation with your customer, right? So
Yeah.
it's going to be more of a conversation there. So I think it can be like really a powerful way to re-engage the existing customers. And then once you've done it, the big side effect, nice, beautiful side effect of that is now I have social proof, and I can maybe use the same tactic and reach out to net new accounts
Right.
and say, hey, by the way, we've already spoken to leaders from companies such as whatever, Coca-Cola, Apple, whatever your customers were that
Hmm.
you spoke to, which will bring this extra, social proof, and increase the, you know and then the last point there, I think it's also important, is probably the easiest way to get in contact with people is through a common connection, right? And by the way, when I said this, like having more than 80% of people that I reached out to say yes, was because like the main tactic that I used back then was to find a common connection and ask them for an intro. That worked extremely well. That can work as well for your existing customers. And then again, like if you want to then parlay that into a tactic that you want to use for like new accounts, you could always like check out who they're connected to, and the end of the conversation you could even ask for an intro, provided that that conversation was a positive experience,
Right.
right? You can do a lot of very nice
Right.
things.
No, this is great. This is excellent. I think the tactics are common sense, right? So how do you establish relationship? I think you just need to have that intent, right, to do this and then do it systematically, right? So a quick question on that. So who owns this process? Is it the CS or is it the marketing team? And how frequently does this happen? Right. Obviously, you wanted to have as much of a relationship and then these touch points regularly, but there are constraints, right? In every organizations, there are constraints, people constraints, time constraints, and whatnot, right? So taking a very balanced and pragmatic sort of a view, right? So first of all, the first question is who owns this outreach, right? And for what frequency?
Yeah, I mean, this is very dependent on the organization. I mean, if let's say you're an account executive, you own renewals, and you're listening to this episode, well, then this will be you, right? So you will have to drive this. Whether you are working closely with the CS, you still have to kind of keep owning that and driving that. If you are starting ABM, or you're an ABM marketer, and you want to do this, you want to include this into your account based marketing, then you will own this at the beginning at least, right? Now, ideally, you will kind of turn that into an ongoing process, like you mentioned, right? Into some sort of a regular thing. And like you said, there is a lot of limitation. There is a lot of constraints, both in terms of time, and you also can't expect those customers to just keep whatever every month or every quarter engaging with you if there is not a new incentive. And then I think it's also kind of trying to be smart about it. I mentioned like sending a gift, but I know a lot of companies have a lot of success by creating customer communities. So these are kind of, doesn't have to be like an online community, like a Slack community or anything like that. For example, one of our clients, they run kind of a think tank, a local think tank in their main geography, right? And they made one of their customers, um, I don't know how they call it, like whatever, like a president, or yeah,
Okay.
whatever. Like they
Hmm.
switch, and then they involve a lot of their customers. They also involve prospects, by the way, which is really cool, or like
Hmm.
people who are not yet customers there. But the focus there is completely not on their product. The focus there is on, okay, what are the trends? What are the topics? So it's like a very small enclosed community, that think tank of companies, and they're talking about the topic. Let's say these are CFOs, right? They are not, but let's say, just for the sake of example, okay, they will be talking about, okay, obviously they might be talking about what's going on in the economy, how's that impacting what they're doing, right?
Right.
It's kind of like a thrust. There's a lot of trust in there. You've created that watering hole for them, and of course, like, because you're facilitating that, because that's like a very regular way to get in touch with them. I know that a lot of companies have beautiful customer events. Salesforce is extremely well known for that. They're of course huge, but I remember like a client that I had very long time ago. They did these beautiful customer events that were well visited, and especially when it comes to like niche industries. So they were working in a food manufacturing space, like that was the main industry they were working on. And especially in this kind of industries, there is actually huge opportunity. These people are not on LinkedIn. It's not like you and me. You want to connect to other ABM marketers or demand gen marketers. You just go on LinkedIn. You will find a ton. They will be posting. They will be sharing. It's very easy to connect to our peers. But if
Mm,
you're a CEO of a food manufacturing company or a whatever CIO or production manager there, whatever, well, it's not that easy. And I remember once I went to visit one of their customers. It was a really beautiful visit. And what was actually happening during that visit was that, so my client's customer was showing how they implemented a solution, generally their production process, to a
mm,
prospect of my client. And they spent, the CEO and the head of IT, they spent like 3 hours, maybe, like long time, I don't know, almost half a day doing that. And I went to the CEO once and I asked him, like, why are you doing this? And he said, you know what? It's very lonely. Like, I don't get the chance to learn about how my peers are, dealing with the stuff that I'm dealing
mm,
with, because, in an industry like that, there's like, they are just like constantly putting fires. There's stuff that is happening on the production floor. Their customers are changing their orders. The supply chain is broken. It's a terrible,
mm,
terrible, stressful job. And they never like sit behind a computer and like we get the chance to do, and check each other posts and listen to podcasts. That almost doesn't exist. And so when you can create, and so a lot of marketers will be saying, yeah, but I'm in a niche industry, my customers are not active on social, a lot of the things that you're saying doesn't apply. But that's actually the opportunity. What I'm saying right now is based on the story that I shared. That is an opportunity, because you can then create that watering hole by creating
mm,
a podcast, by creating that think tank community, a round table, breakfast meetings. Like, there's so many things that you can do to help these lonely leaders connect to their peers, have meaningful discussions where it's not about your product. And then, of course, of course, sometimes it is about your product in the most, the best possible way, right? So without any promotion, non-commercially. And so then it just is amazing, and you get to build relationship with all of them.
absolutely. I think it's fantastic. And I think part of what you've said around building relationship, connecting competitors, and then having them exchange notes, right, is something that I've experienced. And I was just thinking about it while you were speaking. And it's so powerful. So, first of all, it's organic. And if they hear something about you from a competitor, right, and I think there is no better validation or
Mhm.
credibility than that, right? So I think just question of, again, having the discipline intent to execute something like this, right? So rather than trying to find excuses in terms of why you shouldn't be like investing on things like that. Hey, I'm a digital marketer, I can only try and reach out to people if they are digitally present, and there's somebody else's work to do the field marketing, right? I think if you bring in the internal organization restrictions and things like that into a customer, right, then I think that's where your programs are not faring properly, and not yielding the desired results, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, new programs or breakthroughs or solving these like big problems won't come from keeping the status quo, from wishful thinking and saying to people, hey, we should do that, you should do that. I've seen like a lot of marketers say, yeah, but we asked our salespeople to engage with our buyers on LinkedIn. Okay, and they are not. Yeah, of course not. I mean there takes so much more, and there is no better way than leading by example, right? So I mentioned, like, you asked who should own this, And I said, well, you should own it until you have proven that it's working. And then you can go back to the management and to your colleagues and say, hey, here's what I've done. Here were the results. Doesn't it make sense to make this into a process? And of course, then you can talk about putting it in the right place, right? Maybe
Hmm.
indeed, field and CS or whomever might, it's more logical that they take that over. Maybe they have a better, infrastructure or whatever. But if you just come up like a marketer who is unfortunately not a very, in a lot of organizations, not a very well respected position, unfortunately, it
Right.
is like that. Just it is like that. The chance of getting a change is zero. Leading by example, finding maybe a one person from the sales team, for example, highly engaged, um, SDR or something like that, and working with them and creating something that you can then. That's the role of the pilot, right? So we want to create kind of a minimal viable ABM process and then demonstrate that this is working, and then we can talk about scaling and implementing it and involving other people, etc.
Why do you think this is not a respected position, right? This is something that we come across, right? Not really trying to find a solution, but like, I'm just curious, right? So if it's not respected, why have that function at all? Like where? And do you think that's changing with ABM, for example, coming in because you're now also part of sales team, you're part of customer success, you're not like a single function, but moving in sort of a herd, which is very mixed.
I mean, it's very simple, really. I don't think it's a complicated problem. I mean, when it comes, I mean, the team, one of the most important teams whose respect you would like to win is obviously sales, and then some of the executives, and they want results. They respect results, right? They want to see impact on revenue. And in a lot of companies, marketing is generating leads, for example, doing some awareness activities or generating leads that don't convert to sales, right? Well, that is the root cause, right? The root cause is if you're not able to demonstrate that you can make an impact, you won't be taken seriously. That
Hmm.
it's just a fact, and the perception becomes from after a while. They may give you a benefit of a doubt, right? We'll always be a bit skeptical, but they might give you a benefit of a doubt. But the only the proof of the pudding is in eating it. Like you need to demonstrate, you need to show this impact, and it doesn't have to be like, okay, I've driven 10 million this year, right? It can be, look, I've created this. For example, we spoke about this roundtable or whatever, this kind of small community think tank, doesn't matter. Okay, we've created this, and look, now we're having these conversations. uh, it generated one new deal maybe, or one new opportunity. Okay, it seems to be working, people love it, our customers love it, we have better relationship with them. Shouldn't we be doing more of that? So I'm not saying you necessarily have to do the big thing, but you can. That's the whole idea of the pilot. Like, how can we do a minimal thing, but that actually will have some significant result that the rest of the organization can also acknowledge and see the value in that, so that we can basically get the buy-in to do more of that, or to do with more people and scale it in different ways.
Hmm. Yeah. So if you're a marketer, right, in such an organization, you're saying, of course, I have to create awareness, I have to do nurturing, right? And what do you expect that I convert and then give it to you, to the sales folks, and then just to finish contract? Is that what you're expecting, right? So uh, my boundary, right, when it comes to, let's say, opening a new account, is to create enough engagement, enough awareness that you now take it over and as part of your sales function close it, right? So I'm just wondering, is it that like marketers are not able to do better attribution for the work that they are doing, right? That they don't get respected or feel respected.
No, I think it's. I mean, it depends, of course, right, from the
No,
organization to
generally
the
speaking.
organization. But what we see very often is that uh, the like the way that you described it. All right, so my job is to generate the awareness and interest, and at a certain moment, I need to hand this lead or whatever we call it over to sales. The problem is that we, in a lot of cases, hand over too early, and that there is that's part of it. So, for example, there was an organization that I know that generated whatever tens of thousands of MQLs while sale and hit their quota, while the sales organization didn't hit their quota. So kind of they were celebrating. Well, and the problem is when you look at those MQLs out of basically something like 10 to 20,000 MQLs, maybe a really very small number, like zero point 0.6 or something a percent converted into sales, which is just like, okay, so there is a problem. There is a fundamental problem there. You're handing them over basically contacts. They can, there is no difference between sending an MQL who downloaded an ebook to sales and buying the contact from Zoom Info and sending that contact. There is no
Hmm.
difference. There's no sales intent. So I think that's part of the answer is that we stop too early. We are generating maybe some awareness, but we are not really generating demand in our product. So there is a big difference. MQL is not, generated demand. That's just somebody who wanted to whatever attend your webinar or read your ebook, or
Hmm.
maybe they were just interested, didn't even read it, right? Which is probably the most often the case. And the five step email sequence won't create that demand either. That's not how it works. It takes many touch points over a long time. And going back to what I
Hmm.
said at the beginning, you know doing this demand generation in a consistent way for many years, having a kind of a demand gen calendar, what we see is we see everyday accounts that are extremely engaged with high level limit. Well, that is an account that might make sense to not necessarily hand over immediately, but start working on deeper. And then actually best case scenario is not even about handover as such, but actually working together with sales on moving them from wherever they are into a sales qualified opportunity. That is an ideal scenario.
Awesome. Vlad, this is fantastic. I didn't realize it's almost an hour since we've been talking. I have a ton of questions. Maybe I'll reserve it for the next interview, but this is fantastic. So thank you so much for taking time. It's a pleasure talking to you and spending this last 1 hour. Thank you for what you do and then and sort of providing that valuable content and best practices and your learnings and to the larger community. So we've benefited from our knowledge on this podcast. And thanks for you and your team is doing a fantastic job in terms of enabling the ABM marketers to do and become better.
Oh, thank you very much. That was beautiful. I really enjoyed the conversation. Like you said, the time flew by. Uh, we could have gone on for another couple of hours, I'm sure. So
Yeah, I
thanks
guess so.
for
Yeah. So
having
yeah,
me and for these beautiful words. And if anybody would like to connect, I'm sure that you'll drop my LinkedIn profile in your show notes. We post every day on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect for a bonus mention. If you have heard about me in this podcast, I'll be super happy to let Arun know that that the message has gotten through. We post every day. You can also check out our website, fullfunnel.io, where we also post detailed guides, in-depth case studies, where you can learn about how we do ABM and how you might also be able to pick up some of these strategies or tactics and implement them in your business.
right. So there's also a newsletter that you guys run.
There
So
is a newsletter that fullfunnel.io, I believe, slash marketing underscore newsletter or marketing dash newsletter.
we'll make sure we'll include that. And also a Slack channel, I suppose. Slack. A lot of
trenches of
conversations happening there.
community. Yeah. So we did marketing sin, giving people too many options. I think if you're on LinkedIn, just connect with either Andre or myself on LinkedIn. We'll share a lot of content there. If you prefer email, newsletter is probably the best way to go. And unlike a lot of newsletters, they're trying to kind of tease you and then send you to their website. Andre is really good at providing all the value right there in your inbox, so you can just consume it and learn something without having to jump through hoops.
I second that. Right. Excellent. But thank you so much.